Good evening, and welcome to everyone who made it here this evening in person, and also to everyone who's watching online, and of course those who will be watching this also on catch up. So we have a fantastic lineup for you this evening to talk about complex interlinkages between the SDGs. I'm the third speaker today, Moira Fall from NORAG, and it's a great pleasure to welcome you to the Graduate Institute. And I'm very, very pleased to welcome Mauricio Barahona from Imperial College London to set us up with some scene setting. Mauricio.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation. It's a very interesting experience for us coming from perhaps a different background to actually be presenting to this audience. And we've been very lucky to actually meet serendipitously with Moira because of, well, how things happen, presenting in a common sort of session and actually getting to talk after and explore the basically the links that exist between some of the work that we had done and the work that was being done here, which basically, as you will see, I think there are lots of overlaps. So one of the things that effectively I would like to basically start with is with this title, which actually, believe it or not, was not chosen by us, but we liked it a lot. So basically the issue of what complexity means, and seriously, well, as you see, we are not very serious ourselves. We are pretty jolly. But the idea is that, I would like to introduce this word that is used with very different meanings. For us, actually has a particular kind of meaning that allows us to analyze systems in a particular manner. So I will try to make this a bit more precise so that you see that this can actually lead potentially to explanations and analysis of data that can reflect some of the notions that are perhaps used in other parts of the literature. So everything we're going to be presenting, I will give a brief intro at the beginning, and then Felix, who's sitting there, we have done this work together. He will take over and explain a bit more of the results. And I have to say that Felix has been a driving force behind all of this. He is finishing his PhD now, but he's the one who came to me. I knew nothing about this stuff in terms of applications. And he says, this is something I really want to work on. And I said, okay, are you sure? Explain to me how we can actually do something about this topic. And we together, but he drove basically the analysis, the definition of many of the problems. And then we found very interesting math that we actually sort of like developed. And a word of warning, there will be pictures, but no equations. So we'll try to convey, with words and with pictures, some of the things. Underlying that, there is a lot of code, a lot of analysis. And we can talk about this for whoever is interested, but don't be scared. There is nothing of the sort. Okay, so just as to set up, the issue of complexity. This is a book that actually Felix recommended because it sort of like summarizes perhaps the link between complexity theory, which is actually a branch of math that has existed for some time, and how it links to social sciences. So complexity is something that, it's a branch of applied mathematics that deals with, interactions in systems that lead to effectively behaviors that are non-trivial, and have been applied in the physical sciences, in the biological sciences, for example, in ecology, and in the social sciences, it has potentially a lot to say. What do we mean with this? Well, of course, that's a book. So there are a list of things here that maybe make the point about the difference between what you could call a complicated system versus a complex system. So a complicated system is something that will have lots of variables. They are perhaps interacting, but the relationships between them are linear. Okay. In contrast, a complex system at the basis has nonlinear relationships. Now, I'm going to make this clearer later, but that's a key distinction. Okay. because things are linear, in a complicated system, it might be that things are, you cannot really spot them, but what you observe is just a linear sum of the parts that form the system, which means that you can actually undo the complicated stuff into simpler blocks much more easily. Whereas in a complex system, what emerges is a behavior that is cannot be seen as the sum of its parts. So this has been termed sometimes emergence as a way to summarize that this is not just sort of like a complicated sum of things, but is beyond that. Another important thing that you will see reappearing is that usually one way of understanding a complicated system is that eventually, after all, there is like a description that is universal for the whole system. Whereas in a complex system, things are contextual. So you will have differences between how you describe your system in one piece of your system, let's call it space, and in time. Okay, so there is much more variability that is intrinsic to the system that cannot be explained in complicated systems. Okay, so this is basically, in a sense, what we mean with complex, as you will see in what follows, is a system that actually can generate behaviors that we look at them and we think, okay, these are not obvious, but goes beyond that. It has an intrinsic property of basically emergence, being contextual, and having nonlinearity at the bottom. So what does this mean for some of the problems that we were considering? So to make it simple, a complicated system will be something like this, and this is maybe trying to translate into language some of the things that you consider. Suppose you have a system that has just two variables, and you will be very familiar with something like says that you have a linear relationship between the two, and you will call this a synergy. When V1 increases, V2 increases. And opposite, you will have a trade-off. Okay? And then you can make, systems that are collections of these interactions. And that can lead to complicated behavior, but it will not be complex in the sense that we are describing here. On the other hand, if you have a complex system, what we mean with nonlinearity is something of this form. Okay? So what this tells you is that basically, depending on the value of V1, V2 is either synergistic or it has a trade-off. Okay. See also that it's not linear. So it's non-linear and non-monotone. Okay. These kind of behaviors are intrinsic to many, many systems, both ecological and economic. And taking into account these relationships is crucial if you want to capture the complexity. So our work, in a sense, is trying to find descriptions of that sort that are present in the data. We asked ourselves, are these relationships there in the data? Because if they are, they will be important to the observations of the system. And the answer is, looking at data, and we will present later, these relationships are intrinsic to the data. If you don't consider that, you will be missing the complexity of the system. That's in a nutshell, partly the kind of like the scene. So as a brief like a tour de force, I will just present briefly the main points, and then I will let Felix take over the more part of the results. So just to give you an idea of what we did, and this is where Felix came to me and said, oh, look at this. This is interesting to do. So he was very interested in SDGs for a long time. And he basically said, okay, what data is available? There is data that effectively corresponds to all SDGs. We were also interested in actually considering the effect of climate in a general sense. So we added another variable, which is actually temperature. And what that means is basically that for each of these 17 SDGs, there are on databases indicators. So just to give you an example, this SDG number 3 has 42 indicators in the database of the World Bank. I mean, that's the one we used because it was better curated, but there are other sources. And they have been collected from 2000 to 2019. So there are 20 time points for 42 indicators for just one SDG. There are 17 SDGs. Some of them have 6 indicators, others have 40. So overall, what we have is things like this. You will have basically a collection of, let's say you take a grouping, for example, Africa. You will have this kind of picture where you have an indicator for a particular country, in this case is Cameroon. But of course, then you have this picture for all the countries in Africa. And that exists for all the indicators and all the SDGs, okay? So in summary, what we have is something like this, which of course, I don't want to put you like figures, but the summary is for each of the 180 countries, 181 countries, we have collected those. We have studied 35 groupings of different types. You will see tables appearing later. Some of them are regional, geographic, others are socioeconomic. And you can ask questions about the different groupings according to all these indicators that are available. And there are 400 indicators over 20 years. Okay, so that's the basic data that is there. And what we have done is gone from this big chunk of complex data and transform it into what we call a network representation. So that's the step. The question is how we get there. What this network representation does is it captures interlinkages between the SDGs. Remember, under each of those SDGs, there are lots of indicators over time. You can do this. For example, this is for Africa, so it will contain all the countries of Africa. And you ask questions about how interlinked two of the SDGs are. And you can quantify the strength of that interaction. So for each country grouping, that's what you will get. A representation that is of the whole system of SDGs. And it has all this methodology, which I briefly, in 2 slides, I will tell you. What it does is it extracts the nonlinear SDG interlinkages. And importantly, because this is an important issue, it discounts confounders systematically. Okay. So that's the big summary. And just to show you an example of what we were saying initially, here you have an example of 2 of the indicators, GDP per capita and children out of school for a particular grouping, Latin America and the Caribbean. So if you take this data, this is basically our V1 and V2 variables we were talking at the beginning. And you say, are these things correlated, which is you might do if you were doing your linear analysis that we were talking about before? The answer is, your conclusion would be no, not significantly. You have a very, a non-significant, p-value, clearly, very insignificant. So there is no correlation. However, there is a way to actually get the underlying relationship, which, as you can see here, is non-linear, non-monotonic. It has this sort of like a shape, this U shape that tells you the sort of like the complexity of the relationship. So the method that we use is something called distance correlation. This is where the formulas would go. There are no formulas. It's basically a kernel method that allows you to pick non-linear, non-monotonic interlinkages. It also has another nice feature, which is that you don't have to detrend your data. It can deal actually with non-stationary data, things that are not assumed to be stationary. So it can deal with the data as it is. Okay? And it allows you to detect if there are interlinkages with very few assumptions. The second part that I mentioned, and this is I think where I will end, is the question that you have to take away confounders. So that's a big issue. In socioeconomics, there are many methods to actually deal with confounders. Let's say, do you want to find if there are in regressions, if adding another variable, adds or not, or you can discount. All of those methods are linear. So we have in a sense, a rigorous way of doing that in this nonlinear setting. And we have some examples on how this is done. So what is the end point of this confounder issue? So here you have an example from a paper where they applied some linear methods and they found that there was a linear relationship, a linear interaction between SDGs 8 and 9. This was done using standard regressions. And the others were all basically not present, or they were non-significant. In our method, what we found actually is that the significant ones were the ones between 8 and 4 and 4 and 9. Once you consider that, those two, the linear relationship that you pick between 8 and 9 is explained away. Okay? So that's the key aspect. So what you want to do with this is basically saying is you have to be careful in actually discounting the conditional explanations that you can get from considering all your system at once. So this is done in a systematic way that is quite rigorous by actually taking all the possible subsets of variables that exist there and you discount them. And you are able to actually eliminate those spurious correlations that might exist, or in this case, spurious interlinkages from the relationships. Okay, Felix.
Yeah, thank you, Mauricio. So what we did as an experimentation was applying all of that methodology to the 35 country groupings that we defined. And these 35 country groupings were partly defined on regions, but then also socioeconomic. So for example, high income versus low income and many more. One of the country groupings obviously was world. So we took all countries together and grouped them, which are 181. And then we found that network here on the right-hand side. And what you can see is the darker the edge, the darker the line between two SDGs or between two variables, the stronger the connection is. And we also have the width of the edge. So also the wider the edge, the line, the stronger is the connection between those two. And what we already see here when we look at the world and then as comparison to Africa is that it strongly changes. So we really need to make sure that we find different networks for different country groupings because the relationship between these variables are very, very local, which is according to the understanding of complexity that we have. So I will present 3 different parts of our experimentation. And the result number 1 are these networks as a foundation of everything that we have done afterwards. So there are significant regional differences in the structure, how these networks look like. So here I show you something from Europe, where we took all the European countries, and you see, for example, SDG 9 is strongly connected to 17, 8 is strongly connected to 17. But then when we look at another grouping, which is Sub-Saharan Africa, we now find that the strongest link is actually between SDG 11 and our temperature variable, which is variable number 18 here on the right-hand side. So first of all these networks are the foundation of our results. On top of that, we then took those networks and wanted to find a ranking of the relative importance. So we computed a measure called eigenvector centrality, which is really a relative measure, so a ranking between the different variables in the network, which ones are most central, which ones are strongest connected to all others, and which ones are fairly independent of the others. And again, here we look first at the global north, where we see 17, 9, and 7 being quite central. But then again, set the global south, where we see education, for example, as a number 1, together with 17 and then 8 coming quickly shortly after that. Yeah, so when you look at all of those, we also assessed the 3 most central SDGs. And we see actually 17 popping up quite often in that. So there's a table in our paper where you can read all of those. But basically, we have analyzed all of the different 35 country groupings and found that 17, 11, and T, therefore the temperature variable, are the ones that are most often amongst these top 3 SDGs. Lastly, in our results, we've looked at nexuses, which are, in a network sense, communities of strongly connected SDGs or strongly connected variables. And you've probably seen this graph before, which is kind of I would call it a one-size-fits-all approach, not regional, but this is just how people see the SDGs being most strongly connected. Again, because of the strong regional difference in these nexuses, we don't really want to take a one-size-fits-all approach and would instead have a regional result for different nexuses. So when we look, for example, at the low income, we see here so each column is one nexus. We find for the low income, for example, a strong link or strong nexus around poverty, education, gender equality, and many more. But then when we look at high income, we find, for example, poverty is more related to health, but then also education and gender inequality. So there's also, again, a strong regional difference. And we want to make sure that we really have that knowledge for the different groupings and not take that one-size-fits-all approach. There's a lot more information about it. So on the left top, you see the paper that we published in the Lancet Planetary Health. It's open access, so everyone can read it. Below that, you will find some GitHub code for anyone who's interested in replicating these results or doing some more analysis based on these results. please go to our GitHub page or directly reach out to me. And then we also created on the right-hand side, you see a website where you find all of the results one by one, some more illustrations, some more information, and you can also easily download all of the results as CSV files. As a summary, we took really a data-driven approach. That does not mean, however, that we are not dependent on qualitative expert analysis. So we take it as a very first step, and we want to emphasize that it is purely data-driven. Data is not always perfect. There are measurement errors in the data. Lots of missing data was there as well. So it is really the very first step. So far, we have only looked at complex associations, which are basically how they're related without any directionality. So we can't say yet what is causing what. However, that's the next step in our research. So we call it causal inference or causal structure learning, where we want to find out what is cause and what is effect in those networks. Certainly, we have already made it quite often clear we see strong regional differences, and that's very super important when you apply anything then later on for potential policies. And lastly, we have done the analysis on the SDGs, so on a goal level. However, we obviously took data for the targets and for the indicators. So there's a lot more possible, which made it actually be more relevant for some certain aspects. Yeah, thank you very much for listening. You can scan the QR code that directly goes to our website, but please also reach out by email if you have any questions.
Don't worry, it's not I'm going to speak again. It's simply that I'm in charge of introducing the next speaker. So the next speaker is Nathan Sussman from the Center for Finance and Development. He's a full professor of international economics, and he's the director of the Institute Center for Finance and Development.
Okay, good evening, and thank you very much for having me. I apologize for entering late because I was teaching a class. I see some of my students came over from the other class here as well. So, keyboard, yeah. Yeah, okay, so what I'm going to talk about is relating the SDGs to financing them. And I'd like to, in kind of this few minutes that I've prepared, presentation I've prepared, I will try to convince you that these things are integral to these networks that we just heard about before, and you'll see that, I mean, although economists use maybe a slightly different way to look at correlations, and what I used at least something different, but you'll see that these things are actually similar in many ways. So first of all, I mean, just as an introduction, most of you know these things, but it's always good to put the numbers on the screen or the table, is that there's a consensus that we need a lot of resources to finance the SDGs. So the OECD estimated them recently, including the corona damages, which mainly affected the global south, at anywhere between 2.5 and 4.2 trillion dollars a year. But at the same time, the OECD mentioned in this recent report that if you look at this as a share of total assets under management, this is about 1%. I can just reflect from the class we had half an hour ago with somebody from the industry that told us the management fees in the sustainable investment industry are 2%. So whatever needs to be funded is half the management fees of this industry should it go and finance the SDGs. So this is what we're talking about. So management fees being cut in half, and you have all your funding you need. So this is kind of putting things in proportion in terms of what's needed. So what I've done here is kind of, again, a back of the envelope example of how we would go about this. So again, it's just an example, and it focuses on sub-Saharan Africa, which I think most of us would agree is the global region that requires most in terms of financing for the SDGs. I mean, in the north, we have to do a lot about cleaning the air and carbon emissions, etc. But in terms of the all the other 17 SDG goals, I think most of them are, as also saw before, there's a big cluster concentrated in low-income economies, and sub-Saharan Africa is the lowest income. So this is just an example of how you go about these calculations, just back of the envelope. And what I've done, you see on the left, is the total GDP of all sub-Saharan countries, $2 trillion in 2022. On the right-hand side, I took an example. I mean, there are a few, but this, I think it's one of the most striking examples that economists have studied a lot, is the South Korean miracle, where a country that after the Second World War was basically with income per capita of your average sub-Saharan country, if not less, and today is an OECD country producing consumer goods and phones and stuff that we all consume. So people describe this in the development literature as a miracle. Now, part of their miracle is driven by investment because they invested in the economy for a very long period of time at relatively high rates. So they start obviously slow in the 50s, 60s after the Korean War, but then these things accelerate and they range around 30% of GDP. So back of the envelope, 2 trillion, which is the total GDP of Sub-Saharan Africa. Say we want to invest as we did in South Korea, which is not the case, but let's say that's what we want to achieve. So that would require about 2/3 of $1 trillion out of those 4.5 that we saw in the previous slide. So these are actually not very large numbers by any count. So then, what's the problem? Why is it not happening? And part of it, I would like to try and convince you, is related to what we had before, is these complexities and interactions between those SDGs that cause a lot of problems in implementing these, on paper, relatively easy solutions, at least in terms of money. So again, this is something similar, but in a different way that we've seen before, is what I've plotted here is the SDG index. It's the overall index of the 17 SDGs calculated by the UN. And I show the correlation between the score of the index of a particular country and its score on the World Bank's, IMF's financial development index. And what you can see, again, with you don't need a microscope to see this, is that, and again, this could be done a little bit more rigorously, but what you can see is a very strong positive relationship between financial development, and in particular, I chose the financial institutions development because it's really hard to conceive of creating a lot of very thick and deep financial markets in lesser developed economies overnight. So most of the initial finance would have to go, if the SDGs, would have to go through financial intermediaries and institutions rather than through markets. At some point, the markets will kick in. So this is to give you this positive correlation. And again, you can see the cluster of Sub-Saharan Africa, which is in the down on the left, with very low SDG scores overall. And this is the interconnectedness that we showed before between all these SDGs, but also it's interconnected with low levels of financial development. So here I'm trying to build on a lot of research that was done in economics, and maybe that claims, or at least tries to identify in a very long literature with a lot of very influential papers, some causal relationships between finance and development. Because people say, well, very rich countries have very developed financial institutions. But is it the case that financial institutions contribute to countries becoming rich, or is it just a correlation? So there's lots of literature on this in economics that looked at the causation rather than the correlation between those two factors. So this didn't come out well on this slide. It was nice on my computer, but one thing for sure, the SDG goals themselves in the SDG 8 have some categories that are related to finance, but they focus solely on access, which makes sense from some normative aspect, which is fine, but they ignore what we call financial depth, is what I showed you before, which is not just the access. Access is a necessary condition that everybody has access to an institution, but it's also the depth of how deep are the institutions, how efficient they are in terms of transforming finance to these goals. And I think that's something that's missing in the current SDG goals, which focus, again, for normative reasons, maybe more on access than on what the economists would think is equally important, is the depth of the markets and the development of these markets, not just the access. And the one doesn't necessarily cause the other. So basically, my argument is that in order to reach sustainable development, we have to actually combine financial resources, but also look at financial depth and financial development as an integral part of the SDGs. So here it's also a cause, but also an outcome. But the two, it's the resources and the fact they are. But how do we mobilize these resources? And that's kind of my last slide, on which I can only, again, it's just an example and speculation. And looking at the complexity in a kind of a very stylized way, and it's just an example, it doesn't have to be that way. But what I've tried to show here is that financing the SDG goals, and we see it's not finance, it's not the matter of money, because the money is there. There's some obstacles. And therefore, because of the complexity and the integration, the correlation between various SDGs, there are some SDGs where you want to start first in terms of finance. And then as you achieve them or partially achieve them, you pour in more finance and then more finance. And then at the end, you get to this advanced economy. So here, for instance, this is just an example. And I think that part of the research or potential research is to actually make this a little more substantial based on the integration of these things, the correlation between them, the principal components, all kinds of analysis we can do to see, because sometimes when you target one thing, you have effects on the other. So here, for instance, just for example, because I think it's very topical. So I said, the first thing that sustainable finance has to do in a very, very short run is deal with climate, SDG 13. Because if, all these other things, human capital, financial development, that could take 10, Korea didn't grow overnight, but we'll fry in 5 years if we're not spending on this. So any other investment is just throwing away money if we don't take care of climate first. So it's just an example. You can make it a little bit less stark. Then you want to move to these SDGs that are more infrastructural, like rule of law, governance, or whatever, that are major obstacles in channeling more finance into low-income economies, and so forth and so on. So, all the SDGs, I have one number. I don't remember all the numbers always at once, but and then you move for, once you get some infrastructure and governance, you can really eradicate poverty. But you cannot eradicate poverty without solving conflicts, without having the governance. Because everybody knows it's a good goal, but you can't channel the funds to do that, because investors are really weary about investing in those things because the legal infrastructure, property, conflict, etc. So there's kind of a staging of these things, and in each one of them you inject finance, and then you reach this first graph I show you, that as the SDGs are moving up the indices, and not all of them at the same time, there's some kind of a staggering. Some things go first, some things go later. So we'll move together. We'll move, going back to this slide here. We move up on this thing, and this is something that doesn't occur overnight, but it has to start somewhere. And part of the complexities is where you start, how you stage those things, and how you target efficiently groups of things that you affect one, you also affect the other, some economies of scale in terms of using finance. So the end result, hopefully, is that this thing should work. You get this virtuous cycle of investment SDGs, until we get the low-income economies basically arrive to where we are today in the advanced world. Thank you.
Thank you, Nathan. Our next speaker is Moira Faul. She is the executive director of NORAG, and she's going to give us an overview of some of the vision about these interlinkages.
Thank you, everyone. So the title of this presentation is The Promise and Pitfalls of Intersectoriality. Much as every single word processing program likes to change that last word to intersectionality, we are talking about intersectoriality, which is basically thinking about some of these SDGs are seen as sectors, the education sector, the health sector, the wash sector. And so it's really thinking about how it is that this is framed, what are the potential challenges and also opportunities, and how we might think about them, and how complexity and systems thinking works within that. And so fundamentally, the reason it is that we are interested in this is what researchers call an ontological question. It's the way things are. So we are saying, actually, if the world is complex and we observe complexity in the world, then that changes the way, or it should change the way that we think about them, change the way that we research them, and change the kind of policy solutions we might come up with, the kind of practical things that we might do differently. And in terms of different systems perspectives on complexity, as Mauricio said, this has been going on a long time. We have all of these different ways, from cybernetics to chaos to Kate Raworth's donut model, which is very much a systems perspective, without losing sight of the fact that the vast majority, if not all, indigenous knowledge systems do take complexity and systems thinking extremely seriously. So we have one anomaly in terms of a knowledge system that doesn't necessarily take complexity seriously. And the point for us of systems approaches and systems thinking is really to say, this is actually a range of approaches that allows us to find appropriate responses to the complexity that exists out there in the world. So we did a research project last year on international Geneva, and it was very much around thinking through what is it that could be, what is actually happening in international Geneva around cooperation and collaboration, particularly given the fact that there is an ecosystem, it's a place-based ecosystem here in Geneva, but actually what are the systems practices that we might find, if any at all? And so this was our research design. We identified our sample. We also then looked at their websites. We did interviews to find out their networks and narratives of cooperation. And the last piece that I'm going to be presenting today is building an ecosystem map. The next stage may be to think about how we do community building. So in terms of this building an ecosystems map, we identified through the literature and the interviews that there were three critical shifts that were happening in the world of development, sustainability more broadly: localization, diversification, and decentralization. And on the basis of understanding these three critical shifts, we then did a systems mapping with our partners in Dark Matter's lab, thinking through how we can actually work out what's actually happening in this ecosystem in these three stacks: intangible infrastructures, ecosystem, and spatiality. And I'm going to go through each of those individually first of all. So in terms of the intangible infrastructure, thinking about financing, and I think Nathan presented very strongly that financing is actually an intangible infrastructure. Education is something else that has also been described as an intangible infrastructure. And what we found in this particular project was there was a very, very strong notion that the fragmentation of financing and new opportunities for cooperation and for practice were definitely there. And you can see there's a lot of these nodes that are interconnected in that top layer. But you'll see also that pink node there, which is connected through to the next layer, which is the ecosystem. And in terms of generating ecosystem synergy, these were the kinds of findings that we found and how they connected to each other, and how you can then see them connecting up to that intangible infrastructures level. And then finally, the spatiality. So as I said, Geneva is a place-based ecosystem of potential cooperation. And here we see a large number of reasons that people are giving for the reasons why Geneva is a fantastic place to be thinking about working collaboratively, collectively, and intersectorally across a number of SDGs. And putting all of that together gives you the beautiful ecosystem map that you can see in a large version behind you on the wall. And all coming from this identification of these three critical shifts and being able, through the data and this ecosystem mapping, to be able to say, here are three key pathways for change. If we want to change this system, we need to be really addressing these three pathways. And if we address these three pathways, then we have a chance of building the cooperation and collaboration ecosystem in international Geneva for the SDGs. And we then also identified these three critical actions. And if you're interested, there is a piece that appeared in the Global Policy Outlook that came out in January this year, which is discussing this in more detail. But it's really about governance moving away from a top-down model of governance to something which is much more about convening and strategic diplomacy, was that first critical action. The second critical action speaks directly to intersectoriality. So it's about these aligned endeavors. So we can link the SDGs and the actions that we take for several SDGs, but also making sure that we are respecting the contribution of each at the same time. And then rebuilding International Geneva's mission, making sure at the same time that it is open to and listening to those who are most affected, but who tend to be the least heard, especially in the Global South. And also would add to that young people as a very important constituency here too. So that said, beautiful systems map, the process is as important as the product, and the product requires explanation and sort of disaggregation. How does that help us when we're conceptualizing what intersectoriality means, when we're thinking about how to actually make the difference in these linkages with the SDGs? So the network maps that Mauricio and Felix presented to you, if we think about a systems acupuncture on those network maps, you would be hitting hot points where it's links between the SDGs themselves. This network map is not just a pretty picture, it is a beautiful picture, but it is also data-driven, and it was designed by Bart Gabriel and Anouk Pasquier here. And it really is about saying here, what are the organizations and institutions in international Geneva, that's the nodes on this map, and which SDGs do they work on in a deep and meaningful way? And so here, and a systems acupuncture, which is a phrase from Professor Mayega in Makerere University, that systems acupuncture would be to say, which is the individual institution that might be working across several SDGs, and how do we work with and help that institution? How do we identify a cluster of institutions that all work on a cluster of SDGs in order to facilitate their cooperation with each other? So it's a different way of thinking about how the SDGs are linked. Another way would be, for example, to say we're going to put a child in the center of the SDGs and everything else comes out on that basis. So this would be a potential approach for an organization like UNICEF or Rights of the Child organization. You could also say women and girls would be, if we put those at the center of the SDGs, then that will give you a different set of actions that need to cut across all of the SDGs. So these are different ways of conceptualizing working across and the links between the SDGs, and very importantly, making sure that the work that you're doing is focused and targeted in ways that are useful to the whole system, that actually work across several SDGs at the same time. I briefly showed Kate Rayworth's donut economics at the beginning, and this as a sort of idea of conceptualizing intersectoriality. Here, you very much have the economy being put to work at the service of society in the center and the environment as the outer ring. And so here it's about saying, if we think about it in those terms, and there are other ways of thinking, as Mauricio showed us with the data, Mauricio and Felix showed us with the data, then how is it that that is actually working out for us? Is the economy actually supporting us to maintain ourselves above a social shortfall and below an ecological overshoot? And in an article done with Julia Steinberger, if we say, again, we put the social thresholds on one side and the biophysical boundaries on the x-axis, where we want to be is in that top left-hand corner. No surprise to anybody, we don't have a specific case study of a country, a nation, that is actually in that top left-hand corner. So the real challenge here is actually using the research, the knowledge, the policy solutions to think about how we can actually work intersectorally to move more into that top left-hand corner of the graph.
And so here the key question is, how can we go from where we are now to where we actually need to be? And one very compelling set of answers are put forward by Mariana Mazzucato, who argues that we need to move away from thinking in terms of single SDGs and in terms of single sectors fundamentally, to be working out how it is we can work intersectorally to actually bring about this more just world that we seek. And her proposal is basically to say we can take these sustainable development goals and we can formulate some of the ideas into grand challenges. And that would mean identifying where are the clusters or nexuses of goals where we might be able to make the most difference by working on several goals simultaneously through what she calls a grand challenge. And then translating that into what would then be a lower level mission and designing projects that would work to those. And absolutely critically here, she's talking about a portfolio of projects and experimentation which is bottom up. This is not command style, top down, deciding what it is that needs to be done and by whom, but really being able to say, here's the mission that it is that we would like to achieve. What are the solutions that you might bring that could contribute to one part of achieving that mission? We're not expecting one agency to be able to work out the solution to all of it. And absolutely critically also, as I hinted, is really to make sure that these projects are cross-sector and also within organizations inside the same sector, cross-departmental. And for those of us working in research, absolutely intrinsically interdisciplinary, recognizing that we cannot find the answers to our research questions related to these kinds of topics in one discipline alone, and we therefore necessarily need to work together across different disciplines, as we are in person articulating tonight, where we have me working in international relations, working across to also with Nathan in finance and with Mauricio and Felix in the Applied Mathematics Department at Imperial College, and also working with colleagues who are in policy. So Özge, for example, who will wrap up this presentations in a moment.
And the question here with complexity, and it's the last thought I'm going to leave you with, we did some bibliometric data. Again, that was Bart Gabriel who did that, standing behind me. Using these search terms from 2014, so, the kind of moment when people started thinking the SDGs might be a thing, getting over 11,000 publications, and then looked at the frequency of derivations of synergies, trade-offs, complex complexity, co-benefits. And as you can see,
the synergies and the trade-offs as key terms in these publications really took off. Complexity is not far behind, but as Mauricio showed very clearly, the idea of synergies and trade-offs does not actually capture the complexity. So what is it that we need to do in whatever it is that we're doing, whether it's research or policy or practice, to think harder about how we actually integrate the complexity into what it is that we're doing. And at the high-level political forum where I met Mauricio and Felix, there was a lot of talk about intersectoriality and complexity in the majority of the sessions that I attended. But the problem was it didn't feel like there was enough behind it. And that's why I've brought people here today together to talk about this and to embark on a new research agenda and new policy relationships as well, to actually make sure that it's not just a case of using a word and then you're not actually doing what is required to make that work. Because if we do that, 10 years from now, somebody somewhere is going to say, we tried systems, we tried complexity, we tried intersectoriality, and it didn't work. But what they tried was the vocabulary. They didn't actually do what was necessary or understand what was necessary to do it fully. And being very, very clear about this, this is not the first wave of enthusiasm for systems approaches. I think the people who are here today don't want it to be yet another wave that crashes and burns. What we want to do is really make sure that this is something that is bedded in and is actually doing some good work and able to make the difference in the world and in our own research that we would like it to. This edited book that came out in January is our contribution, one of our contributions to that. It's all open access. That's why the QR code is there for you to click on and access that. And the other piece, which is very important, that came out in what Felix was saying about local knowledge and local data. And this initiative that we have started at NORAG is really looking to reverse this north-south flow of expertise, of knowledge, and say we need to take locally relevant, locally contextualized information and data and experience and expertise seriously in order to be able to meet the challenges, the very complex challenges that we all face. So thank you all very much, and I will pass back over to Mauricio.
Moira. Our last speaker for the session is Özge Eydogan. Not terrible. And she is actually the director of the SDG lab at the United Nations office. And she was telling me she has had a very broad experience all around the world in different aspects of development. Özge.
Thank you so much. So I'm not an academic, maybe just that as a disclaimer. And also we have not, as a lab, prepared a presentation. But before I start, yes, my name is Özge. I'm the new director at the SDG lab that sits here at the United Nations Geneva office across almost the street, I would say. But I'm not alone. I'm part of a lab and we have colleagues here, Trine, that sits here. Hi, Trine, Edward, and also Eleonora. So just a small word on that. I see this sort of small intervention more as a sort of sharing of thoughts, if that's okay, because we are, another disclaimer, at a transition phase, as we had discussed also with Moira at the lab, which is quite interesting. Interesting from two perspectives, I would say, as a policy person, perhaps, that is trying to link all of what you're doing, and more so, hopefully, moving forward, into actual intergovernmental processes, and they will think about international development and how we shape maybe also, hopefully international development moving forward in a multilateral system that is very complex too, right? So maybe that's a good starting point. So the problems or the problem at hand that you're trying to solve is complex, and the systems we're using to solve it are also very complex. But I would argue the way we have approached it, maybe not so much. So I think this is a bit where the disconnect is. And why is it timely? if you think about, again, from an intergovernmental point of view, we are midpoint SDGs. In September, there will be in New York a summit, the SDG summit, where we'll be sort of checking in where we stand. And that's kind of the lead up of trying, so we know more or less where we are, but trying to also understand where are we going. So we have, this point of 2030 in our minds, but to be frank, sustainable development, and this is what we're also trying to reframe a bit at the lab, it's not just about an SDG, it could be an SD whatever, right? But it's about the concept of long-term sustainability and how do we get there. And when we were chatting with Moira, actually, one thing I personally also sort of got reconfirmed is when you look at the SDGs, also a bit of not only foresight, but hindsight, right? Before the SDGs, what did we have? We had the MDGs, the Millennium Development Goals, which really, to be frank, was the first time there was an attempt, and to a certain extent, actually to a big extent, a successful exercise to bring very different parties together, a complex sort of audience together, to do something about our, sustainable agenda as a world, so to speak. Then we moved on. The SDGs were born in 2015. Again, we're checking in. And now the question is, where are we heading from here, right? What have we done right? What have we done maybe wrong? What are the lessons learned? I'm not going to go into each and every SDG, in terms of on SDG 5, this was right or wrong, because we are at the lab not specialists on that. But I want to touch upon a point that was said before several times, and Moira specifically, it's about the sector thinking. So when you look at the SDGs, again, from where I come from, in fact, it is an intergovernmentally agreed, almost a contract, right? So you have to sort of understand that, yes, it is orienting our thinking towards doing things together, towards sustainability. But in the end of the day, it is a product, so to speak, out of a negotiation where loads of people were involved, different political agendas were involved, and you really had to find a way to bring these different voices together. So I think when we do check in on that, and it's very easy to criticize, just let's forget, where we come from. I think that's quite key. Well, we have 17 SDGs and loads more sort of indicators around this. Why do we look at it the way we looked at it? Again, the truth is the international development system, and Mauricio said it, I did work in different settings. We do approach a lot of, I would say, challenges at hand from a very sectorial point of view. I mean, when you look at UNICEF, actually an agency I know quite well because I spent many years working there, you have a child protection section, you have a WASH section, you have, a social protection section, which makes sense. But I think what is the issue there is the interlinkages between the different aspects of the work that needs to be done, basically linking all of that into a bigger theory of change, that's actually often missing. And I would say, as we do check in, again, midterm SDGs, again, from a lab's perspective, where we're really trying to zoom in much more on the systems aspect of things, this is something we would definitely emphasize. Now, where do we go from here, right? Sort of that thought. Again, the truth is sustainable development as a concept is a complex system. I mean, Mother Earth, so to speak, is a living complex system. And we are trying to sort of bring all these different aspects together in a way that is not necessarily taking into account that nature of complexity. And I would say, again, one can, we are really just at the starting of this journey, if I may say. But I think one thing I can clearly see coming out of this is, in fact, overcoming this sectorial thinking into something that is much more interconnected. And again, understanding how the different SDGs, and perhaps that's sort of, a thought that I can also leave here, is when we do talk about, and this is another point that came a few times, this notion of a circle, right? I saw it, the way how it also was put up, is how do you think about that? And I think, interesting enough, development, as we move on and recognize the complex nature of it, it's moving much more towards what we start framing as at the lab as regenerative or regeneration. And again, looking into how we can tackle it interconnected rather than separate. if it does interest you, I mean, we are always very, I mean, on the point, maybe my intervention is quite short because I know I'm cognizant of time, but we are very much interested in sort of having an aspect of thought from the outside. So you can engage with us really. I mean, go on our website, you will see it. But something that I wanted to just personally also share is you put this picture, Moira, of the child at the center. I think, in fact, this is extremely powerful because I think if now that we are thinking of redesigning systems, in fact, this is what we need. I mean, you also made this point, Nathan, on, you know, we don't have much time to go. I mean, the IPCC report, if we speak the truth, was published yesterday or 2 days. I mean, we all know what is at stake, right? I think the time is over where we start talking about maybe we can do a little adjustment here and a bit. No, it's really about systems change and how we do design systems that are grouped around values. And I mean, I saw your correlation on the GDP. I mean, which is good, of course, education, GDP. But the truth is we really need to move even way beyond that. It's not about GDP per se, but concepts that really define whatever is growth, right? Not around financial turnouts in that sense, but actually around what really brings value, I think, around human-centered thinking. I mean, that's one. And the second is, again, on the picture of the child. Why is that, in my opinion, such a key picture? In fact, as we do that, we really have to do it. And this is sort of the argument that we are more and more sort of, proposing with future generations in mind. So if you would be, think of an experiment, you would be born in 2050 and you do a bit of a backcasting, you look back and you would like to understand what type of systems we need to design. You probably wouldn't design necessarily systems that we have in place right now, right? I mean, on the notion of extraction, for example, our industries, our systems are very much based on that thinking. You probably would design systems that, again, take the complex issue that we have at hand as such and actually apply an approach to it that takes this understanding of a living, sort of order into account. And I hope very much so, maybe closing on that note, that as we move forward and thinking what the new SDGs, and this is by no count, saying that we should ditch the SDGs or whatsoever. I mean, we also have to be very aware of the fact that we're living in very difficult times on the politics side of things. It was I think what we got is extremely valuable and we have to build on what has been achieved, but we need to sort of move on again from approaching it in sort of very programmatic ways, in joining the dots and making sure we have the complexity at the heart of, maybe the regenerative development goals. Who knows, what's going to come out of it, but that could be a start point for a future conversation. Thank you so much for your time. And again, I mean, it's been a privilege also to speak, I must say, among scholars, having a bit of a more abstract policy side to it, but I really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Right, we hope we've given you all some food for thought. And we've got Annelise, who's going to be monitoring questions coming in from our online audience. And then if you have a question, please put up your hand and Anouk will come with a microphone and we'll take a few and then do something about answering. Who would like to go first? In the back there, Anouk?
Merci. Hello. Hi. Thanks to the entire panel for very enriching discussion. I'm Amitavo Sarkar. I work at the Global Health Center in the Institute. I have been working on the system actually for almost past 10 years. My PhD was on system thinking and analysis in health. I'm from public health. My question is that this is a very interesting presentation to the panel. So in SDG, what exactly right now my research is on actually access to medicine, and where the SDG 17.616 actually it's very relevant because access to science, knowledge, information. So what I found that there is a policy coherence for development. So this, while we, you all are presenting about that, say the systems. So now, say say goal 1, goal 2, goal 3. So there is a policy coherence. So if we now further inflate it and then go to the subsystems, and then perhaps they're talking about coming to the point of the complexity. Here, my one point is that it is from my own understanding, please, that the complexity, when we are actually conceptualizing it, it is coming from more of the physicality, the physical system, more or less the physicality, the physical system. Now here, have you encountered, as being a scientist, researcher in this say, that especially when you're dealing with, say, health-related SDGs, climate, biodiversity-related SDGs, which are like evolutionary biology, this is a bit of different. So even the pandemic, I mean, including our models also failed, by the way. So I mean, this complexity, chaos, as well as the biological diversity, the biological system, the ecological system, how you are bringing it. So this is quite fascinating for me, for the network analysis and even for the systems thinking in that. So this too. Thank you. Thank you again.
Thank you very much. Do we have another question?
Oh, Idalia Rodriguez Morales is asking, thinking about the first presentation and complementing with the second, I wonder if in the network analysis you are able to control for or overlay into the network the amount of funds, finance, and or hashtag of organizations working in each SDG space. Wondering if the great amount of donor funding and organizations working in education impact that result of it being in the top for Global South. And then we have another question by Rasha Sharaf. He says, a problem of policy reform given the complex nature of SDGs. Some indicators can move faster where the pace of attaining goals differ from one variable to another. A challenge is the prerequisite variables holding back, starting another. And then we have a question for Nathan by Raymond Sanner. He says, indicator 17.17.1 PPP, after 8 years of talking, remains a level 3 indicator, meaning no methodology, no data. The custodian is the World Bank. How come the economic community cannot help them out to produce a level 1 indicator? PPPP is crucial and controversial, hence help. Best Raymond.
Right.
And I think that's all.
Okay, that'll do for now for a starter. Shall we start with you, Nathan?
Okay, so I can actually address a couple of questions. So first of all, there was this question before about interlaying what the complexity with institutions that you both showed and with the financial system. So actually, I wrote down an idea for a paper, and because I always learn in these events. I mean, I have something to say, but I come to hear. So it's so actually there could be work that be easily, I mean, not easily, but it's something that's feasible, is because all the impact investors, for sure, the DFIs, they report the volume they spent on which SDG goals they addressed. And you can create, using the same sort of network analysis, the networks of these, because it's both in terms of the quantities, and also where they're located, where countries, whatever. You have all this information about these investors. I mean, that's a nice thing about the reporting, and you can basically transpose or I don't know what the correct word in your complex systems are. I'm just a simple economist. How do you kind of overlay these things in some meaningful way and combine the financial flows and how they're related to SDGs and complexity with the, say, the institutional arrangement, like the maps of institution Geneva or the thing that Felix presented before, which is more kind of so I in that sense, I already down as I was hearing you already a research idea here for us to pursue, which I think answers this one of the questions. In terms of, I'm not a representative of the World Bank, so I cannot answer. Maria Dimitri was a good friend of mine, but I'm not going to answer why. But but it's definitely some of these KPIs in the entire universe of the SDGs, not just the GDP related, are definitely and need more precision, and it's again something that would also help the financial industry, and that's a different project we're engaged is in measuring this impact. A lot of these things are kind of loose, and it's not just the straightforward economic measures that need more clarification and more precision. So that if we want to spend on these things, or if you want some more concrete dashboards for actual action, a lot of them have to be kind of maybe, again, there should be some dialogue between the people who are investing and the people that through the very complex process created those, and sometimes with a lot of compromises. But in the end, people on the ground want to put the money. They say, do you invest in this? Do I do that? And one has to kind of translate or have a feedback back and forth and kind of refine these things. So maybe that's kind of something to do for the next 7 years if you want to get the money. And again, as I showed, it's not a lot of money. It's all available. If we can match it and show that people have to match it, it's doable. It's not really. But again, what they're missing is this: how do we match the funds we have with the goals, and how we report back, and how we convince our stakeholders that we performed our fiduciary duty to invest in impact promoting ventures.
Thank you. That's good.
Maybe I can just come back on the matching. I agree, but I personally think that's one part of the story, if I may say, because I think one issue that maybe goes a bit beyond this discussion is also on the risk factor. Because I've worked myself in an international financial institution a while back, though. It is true that, again, the SDGs, to a certain extent, they are a political agenda, if I may say. I mean, they do provide a good roadmap, but they do not provide concrete solutions on how to get from A to B to Z to D, if that makes sense. So that is quite, I think, something that often people also criticize, again, but it was also not meant to be that way. But I think when it comes specifically to the financing part of the story, it is true, there is, especially I would say from a private perspective, a bit of this, and we have that at the lab too, where people come and say, how can you link us and this and that, which we try. But I think it's also this notion of, and this is a fact, is when you do invest in environments that are very poverty driven, where you have huge amounts or very big sort of large gaps in terms of inequality, the risk that you're taking as a financing entity is just much, much higher. So people do oftentimes actually know where to invest, but they're not necessarily inclined to invest because it does come with, again, a higher risk, a higher defaulting probability, and who's going to pay for that? I think this is oftentimes the issue. Maybe one point, if I can, another final, sort of building on that, because I do also believe, and again, this is maybe something we haven't really touched upon, but I think as we do reflect on how a new or redefined sustainability agenda could look like, the notion of values is also quite important. Something we have been thinking is, like, we are midterm now, and yes, we are talking here a bit in our bubbles, if I may say something about criticizing, but we are privileged. The urgency out there, outside, I wonder how many people you meet that actually know about the SDGs is my first question. And the second is, again, yesterday IPCC came out. I do not think that because of that, the level of activation has increased exponentially. I would love to believe that, but I do not see that, at least. So I think how we, and I didn't want it to get into sort of the nitty-gritties of sort of the UN language, but when you do go into what it's called our common agenda, which is kind of the vision of the Secretary General moving forward, he does speak about global solidarity, for example, which touches upon values. And again, that's not the data, that's sort of more the quantitative side, but I think these two parts, they very much complement each other. And I do feel as we speak in terms of how we can move forward on the SDGs and beyond that, the aspect of looking in that sort of what you could also maybe frame as, to a certain extent, effective science. How do we look into emotions, and that is also a bit overlooked. And I think that, again, speaks to complexity, because we as humans are very complex. We are the ones who negotiated, different types of humans, the frameworks. that translates, of course, also into that. And I just leave it you. It's maybe not necessarily a response to sort of the question per se, but I felt that was maybe also interesting to share. Yeah,
definitely. Thank you. Mauricio?
I'm not sure I can say something super direct to the questions, but I was reflecting from the comments previously. And I think one of the interesting things from me coming from the outside was to realize, so as you saw in what we presented here, we have talked nothing about causal, neither in terms of actions. We are very deliberate on this. It was purely an analysis, if you want, a piece. It was, this is what you can get from the data, and complexities can be inferred from those. But there was no plan for actions, and definitely not causal. I think that's a next step, but it also brings several issues to the fore, which I think are very important potentially before even getting there, which is that in economics, everybody knows that declaring the game actually already, in a sense, induces behavior. And that's a very important issue because effectively, for example, declaring that certain things are a particular indicator and that goes in a particular SDG are already producing an effect. Declaring that potential, because people will target particular indicators, simply because politically you will have more credits in producing an impact, an improvement, let's call it like that, in particular indicators. So the unintended consequences of that is that because one has presented those indicators as potential targets, they have implications for other things that might be unintended. And it is not only about, if you want, the analysis, but in a way, the declaration. So I have no idea what is the process that led, because for us, this is sort of like a given. These are the SDGs. These are the indicators. I know there was a lot of work in preparing those things, but that, in a sense, because now is out there as general policy, it already is producing a kind of dynamics of itself. So when you presented your cycle of how to act, in a sense, it has this internal kind of game idea in behind there. And in a sense, it's partly trying to unravel how one can avoid some of the traps that are already laid into the declaration of the game. One of the things that one can do is, in a sense, is precisely try to unearth those potential traps. But for us, it was very interesting to see how basically, what you declare to be an SDG is important. What you put inside each of those boxes is very important. On top, Moira was telling us this morning about the fact that, effectively some of these things are spread against, between agencies. That is important because no matter what, those structures are there, and the way you act, is going to have to take this into account. So it's these layers of things that are not even about, ours is purely observational. These things are complex in the interlinks, but there is another level of the interventions that have to take those things and piece them apart. It's purely an observation, not a proposal for the moment.
So I will try to answer the third and the second question. The third was about that some indicators move faster than the others, and the second was more about how is the funding distributed across the different SDGs. So definitely true that some indicators move much faster, can be either positive or negative, and that is most likely somehow related to the funding available in the certain countries, right? So probably all of you know much better how funding is at the moment being distributed to achieve certain SDGs, or at least to progress them. But definitely some of them are much faster, much quicker, the quicker rate changing than others. What we took as a fundamental, and that's maybe very related to the country, what priorities they set, right? And that's totally fair, and they do their own judgment. What we did and what we took as a fundamental assumption is that none of the SDGs is more important than the other. So we did not put any emphasis on this is one which we believe is kind of higher on the priority rank, as they are all just equally important. And what we want is to basically achieve all of them, if you can call it achieve, or at least progress all of them significantly. This is also related to the second point where regarding the funding. This needs to be extremely regionally and contextual. So donor countries are normally, in most cases, the global north countries. However, yeah, they need to be the funding doesn't need to be allocated to the priorities that they set themselves. Don't mean kind of putting a global north thinking on the global south. I would more say that they should very much look into the issues that are prevalent in the global south and then allocate the funding accordingly, which is quite often very different to the kind of common sense in what we know about, like the interlinkages, for example, in the global north. But yeah, I think the funding needs to be allocated to address the challenges that are in the global south.
Thank you. So the question that complexity exists in the physical world, for me, complexity is as soon as you bring a human being into any equation, into any room, you immediately have complexity. And it's so in my 20s, when I was a senior manager in the private sector, in my 30s as a senior manager in the NGO sector, I started out thinking we've got to think about tasks, and it's, Gantt charts, and we've got to do these things, and we'll set up these things and everything will just work because we've worked it all out. And then I grew up and I realized that human beings don't work that way. And this was sort of that real world experience of actually facing complexity and looking at it in the face, and the face was human, and going, okay, I need to change what I am doing because I may be trying to be extremely efficient, but I'm being very, very ineffective. And I think that this is something that's really important about being able to say where complexity lies and how we may need different ways of thinking in the different places that complexity lies. So it is in the physical, it is in the biophysical, it is in the environmental, it is in the human, it is in the social, it is in the socio-environmental, it is in the eco-social, etc. And in each of those places, we may need to think differently about it. On 17.17.1, so one of the issues with targets and indicators is that there is something about measuring what you can measure. So the idea about, do we measure what we treasure, or is it that we treasure what we can measure, is something that's really important when you're looking at any of these sort of targets, indicators, data systems. And in terms of a better set of indicators, because there will never be one for partnerships. Last year, a book that I co-edited with colleagues at the Graduate Institute, Liliana Antonova and Dario Piselli, about the effectiveness of partnerships. We came up with 5 pathways to effective partnerships, and still a gap to make sure that you're actually contributing to sustainability in each of those pathways. And then finally, on the impact question, we have a project where we're looking at the impact investing in education. And also we're starting another, which is looking at EdTech and impact, because there's a lot of impact investing in EdTech. And there are some very promising and positive findings coming out of those. And there are also certain things around impact where a presentation that a colleague of ours gave at a conference a couple of weeks ago, where she looked at a series of EdTech KPIs, and not a single one of them was about impact on education. There was, implementation fidelity, there was implementation of X, Y, Z, etc. But there was nothing about actual impact on education, learning, access, quality, whatever it was. And so, that is one data point. It's not saying that there's anything there that we can make a firm conclusion about. But with impact investing, it's always about saying, it's not just about saying we're doing something in education or in health. It's what is the impact in those sectors as well as the impact for the investors. And we are coming up to time. So I think if you can just take us through the last couple of slides. First of all, we need to say thank you to our fantastic panel, all of you who came together to do this. Thank you so much. And so we have 2 events coming up that may be of interest to you. The first one is looking at the right to education, and a very important philosopher and practitioner who worked in this area. And that is in concert with Teachers College Columbia and the UNESCO chair
on international and comparative education policy here, which is at the Graduate Institute. And then the second one is on decolonizing data, which is on the 4th of April. And you can click on those QR codes. You can find them on our website as well. And we look forward to welcoming you there, all online as well. And you will receive a survey for this event. So please do tell us what it is that we're doing well, what it is that we can improve, and how it is that we can serve you better with these questions. And obviously join the NORAG network. We're a very, very big network, 5,600 members around the world, and you're very, very welcome to join. Thank you all very much for coming out. Thank you to all of you on WebEx for paying attention to us this evening, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. Thank you.